Yeah. Let's put a couple of people this year if we can, and I can see people more of a discussion. Yeah.
Rabbi Wittenberg would like people to come forward so you can talk here. There's places over here. Come and sit further.
Yeah, come in here. It's nice. It's nice that people. It's comfortable on that sofa. That's the. Let's take a couple of those chairs out, and it's much more. It makes more of a group or a circle or a. Yeah.
I don't know.
Here, maybe over here. You can see them now. Right. So we're very excited to welcome Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg from all the way from London. Came in especially for Shiur and Shmooze. And Jonathan, maybe you'll tell us a bit about New North London Shul, and because some people don't know what Masorti is. We met a few years ago at Limud. I think some of you might have heard of Limud. If not, you're going to be hearing a lot more. And today's tzedakah is the blind
guide dogs.
Guide dog.
Yeah.
Israeli dogs. Okay, and that's it. Take it away.
Yeah.
And is everybody got a Megillah?
No, but we all know it.
Well, okay. First of all, thank you for having me. It's very, very nice to be. We've been in touch, and you are. I taught you once before in this group, and you asked me to come back, and it's very nice to. There's something special about teaching in Jerusalem as well, which is sort of not a privilege I often have, having my community in North London. So I was looking forward to this. And I love the Megillah, and I hate the Megillah, I have to say. So it's kind of an intense relationship. I see it, I read it through a very strongly political lens, and I'm not going to take the time or the effort to bother to disguise my own prejudices. And so it was the obvious thing to choose now that we're in the month of Adar, and it's about 10 days off from Purim. And I think I'll give a bit of an introduction, because it's hard to invite people to sort of participate when you don't know the tone and tenor of the direction I'm going. But then I'll introduce for a bit, and there'll be two key scenes in the Megillah that I want to focus time on. One of them will be where Haman has his nasty little conversation with Achashverosh, and the other will be where Esther fasts for 3 days and goes to see the king. Those are the two sort of fulcra that I would like to look at, and then I'd like to say a word about possibly how we might understand the ending of the Megillah, where I have a much less comfortable ending than I think is sometimes might be assumed, and I read it as a really nasty story. So just before coming to the Megillah, the choice of charities, because I love dogs, and I know Noach Brown, who set up from scratch the Israeli Center. He just was motivated to work with dogs. He went himself to America to learn, set up the center here. He's now one of the recognized world inspectors for such places, and he showed me that promotional film. And there was a young man who was sadly blind with his dog, and they were asking him, well, why does it have to be an Israeli dog? Why can't you get your dog from America? It's cheaper to train it there, and you bring it over by plane, and it's a guide dog. Why? He said if the dog isn't taught in Israel, how will it know to go straight to the front of every queue? a great moment. I'm a community rabbi, and the Masorti community, the movement does exist here. It roughly maps onto probably the right wing of the conservative movement in the States. I'm very lucky to have a community that I love, that I've worked with now for over 30 years. Most of that as a full-time rabbi.
They happen to absolutely love him too.
It's a good relationship. Community relationships, it's like family relationships. They have to sort of work well in all directions. And I'm lucky enough to have a very large number of people who do, I think, interesting and challenging things. So I enjoy my work. Beyond that, I'm very interested in pastoral work, and interested in literature and gardening. That has no bearing on the Megillah, except that it does refer to the garden of the palace. But I'm not going to go there.
Excuse me, was Rabbi Jacobs the rabbi of your shul?
He was the founder rabbi of the movement, and he was my teacher. But it's not the same. It's a daughter synagogue of his, and he's no longer alive. These 8 or 9 years. Yeah, but I was very close to him. And, absolutely. So if people don't have text, I think I've got the key verses, but I've got some of the key verses probably in English only. But you won't need the text for the first bit. So the Talmud, I'll say again, I'll take maybe 10 or 12 minutes by way of introduction, then I want to come to these two scenes and spend most of our time on them. I have a very cynical reading from Megillah. The Talmud asks whether Achashverosh is a melech pikeach, an astute king, or a melech tipesh, or a foolish king. And one of my friends and teachers says, I think that his view is that he is neither, that he's a melech adish, a kind of a laid-back king who spends most of his time in a semi-drunken stupor through which he makes mistakes in state policy on a regular basis. He's not the only ruler. My take, actually I rate him as a melech pikeach. But whether or not we do that, the issue that the Talmud puts on the table to judge this matter is a very interesting one. Because the first thing we're told about him is that he is king of 127 provinces. And we're going to learn that this means, each, again and again we're told that each has its own language. Now, for the point of view of government, this is a nightmare. Because how do you communicate? How do you know that you actually have effective power when you cannot know what is going on? And it's the third year of his reign. So he's a new king. And the third year doesn't mean that he's completed sort of at least 24 months. The way you count maybe even less than that. According to the Talmudic understanding of it, he overthrew the previous dynasty of Belshazzar, that Mene Tekel, and he's installed himself as a kind of upstart. And the words that the Talmud puts in Vashti's mouth when she refuses to come before him is Bar Ahur Yerei de Abba. You're the son of my father's keeper of the horses. You're dirt. So to assert himself is of the utmost importance. And the Talmud discusses a decision that he makes, which is he makes a party for 180 days for all the leaders of the realms.
That's a good party.
And then,
We like this party over here.
you might like them at the beginning, but my wife was reading a book about Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wives of the English King Henry II, and apparently once the royal court stayed anywhere more than 2 weeks, they would always leave. And the reason they would leave was there was no sewage management. And so 180 days with all the rulers. I think you might like the first bit, but not the latter part of this party. And then he makes a party for the local leaders of Shushan for 7 days afterwards. And this is the tenor of the discussion. The one who says Melech Pikeach Haya says he can propitiate the locals anytime he likes. But the distant people, no. The one who says he's a fool says get the locals alongside before you invite in so many troublesome and expensive guests, basically. So it's clearly a Realpolitik consideration that is being measured here, and almost with it, whichever way you play it. I would want to read into it how, as a new monarch, can he know who's who, and how can he prevent rebellion in one of those states? And this is very definitely going to be one of we know that this is one of his key concerns. Well, let's have their rulers for a very significant period of time under my eye, in my town, in my palace, where I can see them, watch them and know what they're doing, and not back home fomenting anything. And let me do that as soon as possible after taking power. So I think these things set the tone for the nature of the Megillah. Something else that I want to say by way of introduction is, it suits me in a way to buy into this idea that he's a king from a different dynasty, but whether you do or not, he's a new monarch, and he experiences himself as vulnerable. Why else lose his temper with Vashti for just not turning up? And that's also the advisor Memuchan, who in rabbinic views Memuchan is Haman, whether you take that or not. Is, if you do nothing, you're inviting trouble on every front. So if he's something of an outsider, so is Mordechai and Esther. They've been deported there with the exile, im Hagolah, with the exile that was exiled with the Babylonian victories over Judea. And so is Haman. I think very significantly, he's described as Haman Ha'agagi, which means he's a remnant of the royal line of Amalek. It was I think Agagite is like a pharaoh. It's a generic name for the ruler of the Amalekite tribe. And what's he doing there? Well, presumably when Saul followed more or less Samuel's instructions to do what we would call ethnic cleansing against the Amalekites, he escaped. So Mordechai is a remnant, he's a remnant, the king is an outsider. And when you have politics which actually has some sense of victimhood in it, or minority feeling, or vulnerability, that politics is almost always more dangerous. It's very easily true.
Why do you say ethnic cleansing?
Because he's instructed by God to finish off the women and the children, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't make it nothing. So I was reading a book on violence in the Hebrew Bible, which said, in the ancient world, the great thing to do was to boast of destroying every soul of your enemies, but you never did it. It strikes me in the modern world, the great thing is to boast that you didn't do it, but you do it. And a kind of which is better or which is worse. But I mean, okay, you can say, well, if God said it, it's not ethnic cleansing, but one has to hold a question mark over that. It's very, very interesting that when the Talmud discusses the laws of war in a famous passage in chapter 4 of Brachot, Kvar bas Sancherib uvilbelet haumot, Sennacherib stirred up the nations. He had a policy of mass deportation, so that said you can no longer say Moab is Moab, so you can no longer say Ammon is Ammon. And you sense that one of the things the rabbis are trying to do there is to say the eternal war against these nations cannot be applied in our day because they cease to exist. Is Amalek still Amalek? So there's something there, is the military ethics of the Bible the military ethics of the rabbis of the Talmud? Possibly not. Anyway, I'm going to pursue this. We're given no reason why in chapter 3, of the Megillah, Achashverosh should appoint Haman as his minister. Achar hadvarim ha'ele gidal hamelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata ha'agagi. It's the first verse of chapter 3. After these matters, that's the rebellion by Bigtan and Teresh. The king Achashverosh raised up Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, Vayanaseu, and exalted him, and he placed his throne above all the ministers that were with him. Any offers on why the choice? Do we have any information that could have a bearing on the political considerations behind the king's decision, or do we perhaps have no information and we simply just have to accept it as that?
If there was no information, I don't think you'd ask the question.
Well, I think it's a fair case. It will be a fair. I will argue that we may have some information, but I think it's a fair point to say, actually, we don't have information. Yeah.
If what you were saying before is that Agag is not part of those Midinot,
Yes.
that he too is an outsider, but he's also a dynastic outsider. It's sort of like keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. And you want to give somebody like that a lot of responsibility so that they think they're in a strong position because they're going to be a threat to you as king. But you also want to make sure that you hold them under you. So maybe that would be a reason.
That's very interesting. Variants on that, anyone? I have a variant take on that, which is if I'm a new king, one of the groups I'm frightened of is the people who may retain power from the previous dynasty. I certainly don't want to appoint them. So I'm safer appointing an outsider than I am appointing an insider, because he simply hasn't got the footing in the kingdom and he feels very vulnerable. His vulnerability will be expressed in the fact that he cannot bear anybody not to bow down to him. Extraordinary kind of vanity, which is going to be his undoing eventually. But it may be that that's a consideration. Sorry.
It seems to be part of the Jewish tragedy, historically, that we are the court helpers to an occupying power in whatever country that is not native to that country. It started out with Mitzrayim, with Egypt, with the Pharaoh of Yosef was Hyksos. They were conquerors, and it went on in Roman times and other times where Jews were in certain places in positions of power because there was a foreign ruler who didn't trust the local population, and so brought in the Jews to help run the country.
Yeah.
And,
Like in Greek, in Roman Egypt.
I mean, I think that's extremely interesting, because if you look at the end of that verse, he placed his throne above the other ministers. Now, if you're one of the other ministers, he's making sure he's creating Haman's enemies at the same time as he elevates them. And this is, of course, the fate of Jews in positions of prominence as well. So Simon, you know.
Well, I wonder, he's very simple, Haman. His needs are simple, his desires are simple. He wants power. I think the king understands him and knows what to expect from him. He understands how to keep him, and understands what he wants in life. I wonder if that's part of it.
That's interesting. I think that's also a thought to bear in mind for later in this narrative. But yeah, I can read him, and therefore I can control him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, he
Yeah.
turns on him quickly at the end. Doesn't take a tremendous amount of persuasion.
No.
So I'm saying that doesn't actually like him too much. He was using it for whatever, and at the end,
But he is that kind of person. He was persuaded by Haman, and then he was persuaded by Esther. He's one of the rulers who gets easily persuaded. Beware of those type of people. And don't vote for them. Also.
Or he might, actually have some sense of complexity, which he comes to.
Who's the he? The Haman.
The king.
The king.
No, the Haman's got no. I think so that once Esther comes along, he gets some sense that there are other issues that might be important.
I once actually did an exercise. I just couldn't actually use it because it came out too nasty. But of actually writing Haman's diaries in the night before he was waiting to be hung. You know, here these Jews, they think they're the real minority in the land who are persecuted. What about me? You know, they you know, the Amalek in the Torah is Esau's grandson. And there are two very interesting things. I mean, there's a very interesting midrash, which is grandchildren are often very close to their grandfathers. So Esau, as he's ill and dying, says to his grandson, I couldn't get my revenge on Jacob for that business with the brachot because I didn't want to upset my father. But you. And quite often grandchildren will grow up with a legacy of how their family, you know, how their family's been hurt, and they want to get it back. I think even more interesting is in Sanhedrin, there's a passage about Timnah, Amalek's mother, wanted to convert to Judaism. Complete anachronism, there was no such thing at that time. They rejected her because there's a suspicion of Mamzeh. Her name appeared, I've never managed to quite follow this, but they're very sort of complicated, the relationship. So she says, rather let me become a kind of a common law wife, in inverted commas, to one of that family than be a complete outsider. But look what happens to the people you reject. And there's something very chastening about that. People you reject can very easily become empowered against you. So if these are considerations for Achashverosh, we have to ask how carefully did he weigh them, and how carefully did Haman know his king? And the verse in which I think we should really pay very, very careful attention. It's actually two verses. It's where Haman takes his moment, has made his decision, he wants to destroy the Jews, and he talks to the king. It's chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. If people are in sight of a text, I think it's worth, does somebody mind reading them? Anybody?
Chapter 2.
In Hebrew?
Chapter 3, verse 8. I would say in Hebrew, is that, yeah.
ויאמר המן למלך אחשוורוש, ישנו עם אחד מפוזר ומפורד בין העמים בכל מדינות מלכותיך, ודתיהם שונות מכל עם, ודתי המלך אינם עושים, ולמלך אין שווה להניחם. אם על המלך טוב, ייכתב לעבדם, ל10,000 כיכר כסף אשכול על ידי יוצאי המלאכה, להביא אל גנזי המלך.
Okay. We're going to spend some time on this scene. What reasoning is employed by Haman here, and why would it be effective? That would be my question. Sorry?
let's put it on the market, I'll pay you for it.
Money.
Yeah.
Okay. Money is one of them. Interestingly enough, the king is not going to say, my war chest.
Can I just translate it into English?
Read it. Yes, read it in English as well. I'm sorry.
Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your realm. Their laws are different from every other people. They do not observe even the king's laws. Therefore, it is not befitting the king to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be recorded that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 silver talents into the hands of those who perform the duties for deposit in the king's treasuries.
So we were talking about money. I think you can find all the classic tropes of anti-Semitism in these two verses actually, but the Jews are rich. Is clear. Interestingly, the king is going to say keep the money. It's not the one that gets him most. So the question will be, what are the other tropes and why does Haman use them?
Well, they were always accused of being set apart and keeping ourselves apart, and sometimes accused of being above the law of the host country we live in, although that's not true. So he's saying they're not really citizens anyway.
Yeah. And if we know that one of his concerns is how do I govern such a diverse number of peoples and languages, this is a weak spot for the king. Yeah. He's saying something else.
But it's also not as easy as that, because they're all over, they're spread.
Well, exactly.
You have a whole people that are everywhere you look, they're insidious, and they're even outside your law.
Right.
They're the outsiders. So it's not that they have the money necessarily, but even Haman's saying, I'm willing to pay you, let's just destroy them. Because again, you not necessarily can't see them, but they're everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're outside the law. So therefore, what you have to do, if you can't control them, if they don't even accept you as your king, then you have to get rid of them.
To play the devil's advocate a little bit, we were talking about rejection and beware of what happens when you reject people. A people who lives among all different kinds of people could be very useful to the king should he wish them to be, because they could bring them all together in a way that they can't otherwise be brought together by the king. So it could have gone either way. If it hadn't been Haman's suggestion to do it this way, somebody else could have done it a different way.
And this has been a card played for and against Jews through the ages. The emperor the Sultan of Turkey welcomes them when they're thrown out of Spain because a monarch who throws out their Jews is crazy, because from the point of view of developing business interests, Jews have international contacts.
That's why they went to Poland.
And Jews are the protocols of the others of Zion. Sorry?
The king of Poland needed the money. He took in all the Jews that were expelled from Russia, and then lo and behold, Catherine II got them back again.
I suppose what we hope is that the person who has the ear of the monarch at the decisive moment is going to help people see that the Jews are useful and not make them paranoid. But Haman, who is himself paranoid, wants to infect the king with the sense that here you're vulnerable because they're powerful, they're rich, they do their own thing, and they are everywhere. Now the fact that they're scattered could be a means of control. But this is not what Haman's saying. He said, they have a foot in every camp. They are absolutely everywhere. There's no way you can control them. And, they're in places where you're not. Anything else? That's kind of enough for you, isn't it?
He's also giving another incentive as well, because he's saying, I'll pay you. So even though you're going to lose the money from the Jews, because they're your bankers, your traders, I'm going to pay you the 10,000, which you can keep in your treasury anyway. So the king's in a win-win.
Yeah.
Do you think Haman is paranoid or evil? Because he doesn't necessarily have to believe what he's telling the king. He may be just telling the king what he thinks will get what
Actually, maybe I might say that paranoid is too strong. The two are perfectly compatible.
Not strong enough. Paranoid is not his fault. Evil is his fault. Paranoia is not necessarily the fault of the person who suffers from it. Evil, yes.
My sense is that of all the of the four main characters, Esther, Achashverosh, Mordechai, Haman understands himself least and is cunning, but has limited perception. What about, what kind of man has to go home and tell his wife how many sons he's got? Well, actually, thinking about one probably could conceive of situations in which we won't go there.
What about the parallel with Amalek? I mean, there's a reason that it's in here. Saying that he's I'm saying a parallel as in the evil. Why was Amalek attacked from behind, and the children and the women? Is there some kind of parallel here?
I mean, for sure, we are following a sequence about Amalek through the Tenach. First of all, the attack, which is the Torah reading on the morning of Purim. Yeah. The attack from behind. Then the battle, Saul and Samuel against Amalek. Third round here.
I'm saying, is there a parallel? Because Rena over there is saying that he's evil, and you're saying that he's paranoid. But why is there a parallel with Amalek? I mean, he wanted to kill everybody. My question is there some kind of why did it say Agagi? Is it just because that's who he is, or is there some kind of?
Well, when I was writing this diary, pretend diary, I realised I couldn't actually use it because it was what would Haman say? Said I'm a descendant of the great Malak King Agagite. The Jews who think they're so good, their God, they say, instructed him to destroy all the men, women, children, and all the animals in my entire people. And they all but did it. And when their prophet came, he was even worse than their king.
Yes.
Because he finished off the last of them. And God was angry that they didn't do their genocide neatly enough. And I'm a survivor of this, and I'm supposed to tolerate these people?
Yes, but we're obviously forgetting the first narrative of this whole story, aren't we? That when the Jews came out of Egypt, and all these incredible miracles that were taking place, and making a nation happen, and become a nation, and the splitting of the Red Sea, which was basically publicized according to many explanations all over. So there was something everywhere. You couldn't miss that miracle happening. The first nation that had the gall to fight against the Jews, to go after them, was Amalek. And we have a responsibility.
Yeah.
And we say it every morning in Shacharit. Don't forget what Amalek did to you.
Yeah.
So the parallel is very clear.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm thinking if in a very cynical way I was to put myself in Haman's head, I could create that narrative if I wanted to.
Yes, I understand.
But I think you're also right.
The narrative conveniently forgets the reason why Amalek is more
Yeah, I suppose you're absolutely right. Don't all narratives. And if I wanted to go one step back, I could say, well, I grew up with how my grandfather was dispossessed by their grandfather. Very interesting phrase. I don't think there'll be time in this one to go into it, but Amalek is described in the Torah as Velo Yarei Elohim. He did not fear God. And there's a limited number of times in the Torah where that phrase appears. And they're all, I think, of the greatest of interest. When Abraham has to explain to Pharaoh why he passed off Sarah as his sister, he says, Ki amati rak en yirat Elohim b'makom hazeh. There is no fear of God in this place. And it seems to represent, and it's always used, of non-Israelite, non-Jewish nations. So, in the Torah. So it represents some sense of a universal moral standard by which one will not kill somebody, one will not take their wife, and you'll not rob a stranger. And there's something here about what happens in societies, there's by implication, where there is one is unable to make any kind of basic assumption about any kind of moral position at all. Which is why I would regard this as an amoral book, where we fall back to the dog eats, I like dogs too much, wolf eats wolf, politics of survival. I want to go on to the next verse here. Would you mind just reading it's verse 10 actually, read it in Hebrew and then in English. Vayasa HaMelech.
Sorry, what verse did you say?
Verse 10, chapter 3, verse 10, sorry.
Yeah.
Are you okay to go on? Yeah, sorry, yeah. Sorry. Verse 10.
Vaisar Melech et Tabato mi al yado vayitna lechaman ben hamdata ha'agagi sorei hayudim.
Okay, do you read in English as well? Yes.
So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews.
Why did he do that?
Because that's what you need
It's
to
an
seal
official
the deal.
thing.
Sorry?
That's what you need to seal the documentation.
Okay, why did he give the ring to Haman? Why didn't he do it himself?
Blame on him.
He didn't want responsibility.
Well, it seems like that. And now, this verse is very, very clearly based on another earlier biblical
Yeah, it
verse.
sounds like Pharaoh and Joseph.
It is absolutely like Pharaoh and Joseph, and it's worth just going there. It's in Miketz. It is totally based on that. Let me just find it. And Joseph has interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph says, "Let the king appoint a man." What's his actual words? So Pharaoh says after Joseph has finished his speech, there is nobody as intelligent and wise as you are. You shall be in charge of my household, etc., etc. The Pharaoh took his ring from off his hand and he put it on the hand of Joseph. Now, here's the question. Who is cleverer, Pharaoh or Joseph at that moment? Who would you go for?
Pharaoh.
You say Pharaoh, you say Joseph. Why?
Well, it depends on what you're referring to clever about. I mean,
Who's
it's a great
politically more
political-
astute?
It's a great political move for the king.
So Joseph masterminded the whole thing, so he's astute for sure. Why might one think that Pharaoh's astute?
He's delegating to the right person.
Sorry?
He's delegating to the right person. He's
Okay. Is it, I mean, I'm thinking in terms of British politics. Is it good to be Home Secretary in America, Secretary of State, when you've got 7 years of famine coming? A major depression. Who's going to get the rubbish? Who's going to get the rubbish? Yeah, I think in that moment, I could imagine a Pharaoh thinking, first of all, great, I've got the person we need to save Egypt, I buy this interpretation you're reading out. Also thinking, great, let the ... hit the fan somewhere else than me. And so that's...
You can always get rid of him if things go wrong, if Joseph screws up, and then blame the Prime Minister while the king is still safe.
Blame the finance minister.
Yeah.
And all this is the daily stuff
And
of
if it's-
the world's newspapers.
And according to one midrash, one Rashi that says that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was actually the same Pharaoh and not really a new Pharaoh, it certainly makes the case for these occupying Hebrews, these occupying, collaborating Hebrews, to later be enslaved, because Joseph enslaved Egypt. In the last year of the famine, they sold themselves.
Yeah, Joseph makes them sell their money, their person, their animals, and mortgage their land. Now, is that an act of mercy or of coercion? But it's, given that basis for the verse, coming back to the context of the Megillah, one might read Ahasuerus's response as smashing. Go ahead and do them. You've completely convinced me. I am worried about insurrection. These people are a trouble in exactly the way you say. I'm thrilled. Deal with them. But you may also say, deal with them and you deal with them. Anything goes wrong, and I would say, wait a minute. The signet ring is in your hand. It's not in mine. It's in your hand. So if a head has to roll, it's going to be yours, not mine. Haman doesn't notice this point. Not now. But I think there's a moment, to my mind, it's an astute political decision by the king to say, do it, you do it, and keep the money. Let the Swiss bank account be in your name. Scandal going through Britain at the moment.
But that's different than in Yosef.
Yeah, because Yosef was called by Paro and
Yosef, the king, the
Yes.
king still got the money.
Yeah.
The king, it was all for the king there. Here,
Yeah.
here, the money just makes Haman look worse. If,
Yes,
if things
yeah.
go down.
Yeah. But so I wonder whether the Ahasuerus is sufficiently cunning to play this politics off again. Now this is a major bearing on the ending of the Megillah. We end on this up note. I'll keep that back till I'll keep that back till a bit later. I would like to jump now to a scene which I find fascinating, which is, I think it's in my view, it's the fulcrum of the action. And it is where, I'm sure the story is familiar, but to run it through, Mordechai hears of the decree, he wears sackcloth and ashes, he sends to, Esther sends him different clothes, he refuses to accept them, she hears the story and she says, sorry, ain't much I can do, I haven't been called to the king for a long time. To which Mordechai says, Im hacharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot. It's one of the moral, most powerful moments in the Megillah. If you are going to be silent now. I had a wonderful story about how somebody went to South Africa to fundraise for some sort of Jewish cause, and after visiting their wealthy person they wanted the money from, wrote them a little note quoting these words, if you are silent now. Unfortunately, the person they wrote them to knew the rest of the verse, which is At uveit avich tovedu, you and your father's house will perish. And the person replied, if that's what you wish on me, I'm not giving you a penny. Serve them right. But then she hears, and she says, I'm going to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And she does. And in the morning, just picking up the verses, chapter 5, verse 1. Vayehi bayom hashlishi. It happened on the 3rd day, Vatilbash Esther Malchut. Esther put on majesty. Vatamod b'chatzar beit hamelech. And she stood in the courtyard of the king, and her question to the king is going to be, Yavo hamelech v'Haman, let the king and Haman come to the feast, and they do. And at that feast, she says, when the king says, half the king, come again tomorrow, we haven't finished the food. And I have a series of questions. To me, one interesting point is, how do we understand that verse, Vatilbash Esther Malchut, those words? Secondly, the classic, the Talmud asks this question, what made Esther invite Haman? And thirdly, why waste 24 hours?
To denounce him, you mean? Or?
Yeah, what is the strategy here?
It was a threat.
Sure, why wait? Why invite him to the meal if he's a threat? Well, wouldn't it be much easier to have Ahasuerus alone and say, King, this is trouble?
He might be suspicious.
Well, she was setting a trap.
Yeah.
Trap.
What trap?
Get him to talk and,
loosen
to
up.
get him to... I may be mixing the...
No. Clearly, much of the important consideration is not referred to directly in the text. It's inferred in the text, so we've got some space.
Well, to get him to talk, to badmouth continually, and then then Ahasuerus knows very well who she is, and then she sets the trap for him. So
what happens to the king when he goes home from the first party?
Can't sleep.
He can't sleep. Why not?
Maybe she drugged his wife.
Well, because she came in front of him without him asking for it.
Sorry?
She showed up in front of him in front of the king to begin with, without an invitation, which is not the usual thing to begin with, right? She asked him to come to this meal with Haman. Now Haman is like the top vizier. If you're asking Haman to show up too, that means there's something to talk about besides just having dinner together. Logic?
Yeah.
Without any trappings involved. Great. She didn't come forward with any specific question. She said, come to dinner again tomorrow. So obviously he's left with a question in his mind, even on the most basic fundamental situation, without any kind of intrigue at all involved.
I largely buy that. Not so much the fact that that she had the temerity to appear before him unasked, because he could have let loose at her that first moment, and he didn't. But much more that question that is sitting there. If you were Esther, let's imagine the scene here. I imagine they didn't serve raw vegetables because they weren't health conscious and they had lower quality food. How would you play your role with Haman and Ahasuerus? You'd flirt with Haman?
So maybe that was the reason that he...
No, but she's dressed in royalty, so she's put everybody on the same footing as well, because she's invited also the enemy, Haman, who's now the first minister, Edom, as well. So it's the king and Esther with her royalty, with Haman the first.
But
so
doesn't know that.
Right, but so this is all like setting everybody up to be equal, and therefore playing it in a nice environment, so that he then goes away, can't sleep because hang on a second.
But maybe he can't sleep because she flirted with Haman.
King already
She's trying to get him annoyed.
So couple of yeah.
Maybe she didn't have to flirt, because inviting Haman, and she hasn't seen Ahasuerus for a long time. Ahasuerus is a vulnerable king and possibly a vulnerable man. She hasn't seen him for a long time, wants to see him, and then invites Haman. That's already, it's putting him on an equal footing in not just a political way, but also a personal way. And it could kind of...
But the waters are being reported.
When you organize
But
business,
that's postmodern, kind of discussion.
It's very. I kind of buy all of this almost. Yeah, go on.
when you organize a business dinner, you usually have like the list you got from your boss and the people that have to be there. And then when you make the invitation, they ask, I'm bringing this person, and I'm bringing this person, and this one from this ministry, and this one from this ministry, and this one from that one, and this one from the Ministry of Finance as well. All of a sudden, instead of a group of 5 intimate people, you've got a tenor. I don't think that Esther was completely oblivious to diplomacy on some level.
God no.
If she's inviting Ahasuerus, the closest advisor to Ahasuerus right now is Haman. He's coming too. Yes, she had a matala, but she wouldn't bring Ahasuerus on his own to the first dinner without having Haman. Even if her whole matala is to put it out on the table, then this guy's coming to kill me.
He is her husband.
And don't forget,
Darling, for the first time I'm seeing you for a month, but let's not dine alone tonight. She just very easy. I mean,
Well, then
Esther,
she wouldn't come in front of him. She'd send
Esther-
a messenger with an invitation.
Esther has spent 12 months sort of up to her neck in different kinds of oil and perfumes, soaking away in the harem.
Yes, but this is not the same.
Presumably they discuss to some fine degree how they reckon men work, because the Rabbi Elazar Modai in a after a list of midrashim there, he says kinatu b'melech kinatu b'sari. She made. She created jealousy between the king and him. She created jealousy between the other ministers and him. Now, jealousy could be on 2 levels. You could have sexual jealousy, in which case, just enough to flirt, just enough to mean what's going on here. Or you could create political jealousy, which could be done in a different way, by directing 80% of your conversation to Haman, and making sure that half of it was in a whisper. Well, that's probably a more dangerous game. But then the king can't sleep. And what does the king do? He calls for the book of remembrances, and when he comes across Mordechai, having mentioned big time the Teresh, what's being done to honor him? In other words, I need a counter hero, and I need him now. And that's the moment when he's knocking at the door, and it's Haman. It's very convenient, except that the king wonders if he's left it too late, and Haman and so he's extremely glad to have the opportunity to humiliate him, because he needs to do it, and he needs to do it quickly. Now, my take on this is that Esther has as good as thought this through beforehand, that that's the 3 days and the 3 nights. And when the text says Vatilbash Esther Malchut, there are 2 conventional explanations. One is the obvious one, she dressed nicely. The other, which is this kind of spiritual one, Malchut.
That's the spirit of Malchut.
Yeah, it's a spiritual Malchut. The sacred, the radiance of God's presence accompanied Esther into this, and this was God's, as it were, the absent God is present in this manner. I want to suggest a different way of taking, a metaphorical way. Vatilbash Esther Malchut. Esther put on the tactics of politics. And she did it. She did better than the others. I mean, she does come across as the cleverest. And she's rightly the hero of this. But that kinatu b'melech, kinatu b'salim seems to be the way the king worked, because I think she knows that if she goes to Achashverosh and says, actually I'm Jewish, and Haman's got it in for me, what's her chances? 30% of success, 30% he won't listen, 40% failure. She can't risk it. She cannot follow a policy that is a high risk. It's got to be a very low risk policy, because everybody's life is at stake. And because politics is highly personalized, maybe it still is. By the time, I often lay in the Megillah, and when it comes to the king asking to Esther the second time, Mihu ze ve'ezehu, part of me is tempted to do that as a fake. He knows exactly who it is. And Esther knows that he knows. And Esther has nothing that, the door, the bolts are gone from the door, it's an open door, all she has to say is walk through, and the king wants to walk through. She's nothing left to do. So, that's, to my mind, that's the fulcrum. That's the fulcrum of the Megillah. I want to raise one more point, and then just, how are we doing on time?
Fine. 10 past 9.
So if we take if I say one more thing about this, or a couple more things, and then we give a few minutes to discuss. The end of the Megillah is very disturbing. It's disturbing in two ways. It's partly disturbing because of this. I mean, it's not exactly politically correct in our day that the Jews defend themselves and kill off one hell of a lot of people.
Yeah.
But interesting, to just point out to my teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, is that actually after the first round of violence, Ahasuerus asks Esther, what else do you want? Hint, hint. And she says, Yinaten gam machar. Let's have one more day. In other words, it doesn't suit me to have the ceasefire now. I need another day. But actually, the king has prompted this, because it suits the king to have the Jews root out everybody connected with Haman. He doesn't want them left, they've proved a danger, there's no interest in letting them be, and rather like having Haman take the ring, let's have the Jews do the dirty work. And my sense of the ending of this Megillah is it's provisional. How's it end? We end...
Taxes.
Taxes, exactly, yeah. Taxes there will always be. It ends with taxes, but also divrei shalom emet for shalom, or shalom emet. Words of peace and truth that are sent up. But it seems to me that we feel that we end the story in a position of strength. We've overcome our enemies, and we have for that generation. But the slightest pretext, the slightest issue, and the king can say, Mordechai, Esther, you Jews, I've got a problem with you because of the blood you've got on your hands. And they say, well, king, you put it there, and he says, well, I've got the power, thank you very much.
It does say that they were allowed to defend themselves, if you notice.
Yes.
The actual word is that they defend themselves, which means that their enemies were armed to the teeth to kill them. Well, take that into account.
Oh, no, I'm not blaming.
It's not the Jews went on a bloodbath.
No, I'm not blaming I'm not taking a moral decision on what the Jews did then. Although it does also say Lihina ke meme oyevehem, to take vengeance upon their enemies, and Rabbi Me'ame'aretz mit Yahadim, which suggests, one of the translations of that, many of the peoples pretended to be Jewish, ki nafal pachat haYehudim alehem, because they were scared. Nevertheless, they had a threat of death upon every one of their heads, and now, who's going to stand in judgment? I'm interested in the way the king plays the cards.
I see.
And he's going to leave others with vulnerabilities in case he needs. So that actually, I'm saying the ending is provisional. This is the cycle. I mean, this is a diaspora text.
Most certainly.
It's most certainly a diaspora, except that, to some, you won't like me for saying this, except for perhaps superpowers in our day, the whole world's a diaspora. In some ways. Yeah?
I don't understand what you mean by what you just said.
The last sentence, or...
Yes, the whole world is a diaspora,
Yeah.
so...
Compared to USA or?
What I mean is this, that actually one wants to think that one's destiny is in one's own hands. But unless one is a superpower, one is playing related games of political, of political diplomacy and the statesmanship, which was part of the Stadtland's role when Jews were in a minority, and how to play off others is still the statesmanship needed if you're not a large country. There's a wonderful poem by a Czech poet, Herbert, is that his name? I blame the small countries. It's their fault for getting devoured. So I think there's something of the rawness and nastiness of this text that just hasn't gone away from our world. Wherever we as Jews are. Which I find that's why I find it a frightening text. And then, so why celebrate Purim? My teacher, Jonathan Wittenberg's view was, while the ice is thick enough to dance on it, dance. It's not total comfort as far as I was concerned. Yeah, I'm going to rest it there and see what comments come up. Yeah.
It's not clear to me why, maybe this is cynical, I guess it must be, why we would expect permanent power and that it wouldn't be provisional. This part of the story is so much more like the Yosef story than the first part with Haman, when Haman gets the ring. This part is, we get the ring, we get the power for the time we do, but Yosef has the power, and then Vayakom Melech Hadash b'Mitzrayim, who sees us very differently, and that's the way it goes.
That's the way of the world.
And it's not even, I'm not even certain, it's about superpowers. Rome did not stay. Greece did not stay. They don't. The power moves. It goes to different people. It gets abused and it changes in all different ways, and the people who wield it change as well.
And where?
I appreciate it. No, I agree. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah.
And there is the other side of how does it go? Be like a reed, be able to bend. As opposed to it's not the oak. What's the name of it? The cedar.
The cedar, yes.
Which will break. So I think in many ways we're far more reed-like than most of the other beings, and the power sits on us sometimes and leaves. Yeah. And I'm not sure that this story is meant to be a story about lasting power. It is about the politics, but it's not lasting.
It's about provisional. It's about managing one's moment and provisional.
And accepting that that's all there is.
Yeah. And it's part of a cycle that will repeat. No, absolutely. I'm absolutely with you on that. Absolutely with you on that. Yes. Yeah.
If this is, as you say, such an overtly political text, why is it that the rabbis say it's the only book of the Bible that will survive in the world to come?
That puzzles me. I've given it a very cynical political reading. I just want to say I'm not generally a cynical political person. But this it just seems to me there's so much in there that has a bearing on some of the most painful moments of Realpolitik that calls out to be interpreted in that way. Maybe because the world to come is the opposite of all the things you just said. It offers. Nobody says that in the world to come we'll feel insecure. It's a state of endurance, of permanence, of justice. It's not a state of power play. So maybe in order to remind ourselves of what we're grateful not to have, we read this occasionally so that we don't get bored with what another of my teachers said was being condemned to everlasting gardening in the Garden of Eden. There are interesting. I don't know a good answer to that. It's an interesting question. Yeah. And the relation between Yom Kippurim and Yom Kippur.
Yeah.
A day of disingenuousness and day of genuineness. Yeah. I mean, one can also read this much more like a farce and enjoy it as such. There's nowhere in the Tenach that there's so much drink. There's a large amount of extraneous description, the palace, the gardens, the colour of the floor, the wall hanging. You don't find that, but usually biblical narrative is terse. There's no God overtly in it. Yeah. Sorry, Simon.
I find it quite a relief, really, because growing up and learning this story. I'm from Stanmore. I grew up in Stanmore. I say somewhat proudly sometimes. But anyway, and in Cheder, so hearing the story of Purim, reading this, listening, it was always sort of very sweet. And it took a long time until one day I thought to myself, she must have been absolutely gorgeous, Esther, to have commanded the king and his court in such a way, and she must have had a kind of power, which was not how I was taught at all. It was this kind of, it was almost as if she moved into this position as a waif that nobody really saw her, and she managed to manipulate by being quiet and demure, and so I suppose, I don't know how old I was, but I suddenly thought she must have been something to have been able.
Whatever, however you want to explain that.
But what are you saying? You're saying that she was gorgeous and demure, but is that...
No, not demure. She might well have been in her character. She might well have been her character as my teachers described her. In other words, demure and quiet and all of that. But she had this. She moved into the part and played the part really well. So in a sense, what you're saying is for me quite liberating, because that's not what I was brought up seeing Esther as.
I think she's what the Mossad and MI5 and FBI would call a sleeper in both.
Right.
But she's got the cunning for it.
But then,
I mean, if you look, what's the name of the Megillah? It says that she is the one who really is. It's not that.
Yeah, but this isn't a huge revelation what I'm saying. This was for me. It's a little bit like the Grimm's fairy tales, where you read it as a child, you think that is Grimm. But if you read the originals, they're absolutely, so distressing. So it's a little like that, where you don't get, well, you do. It is quite distressing, all the blood and killing at the end. But that's not where the emphasis of the teacher, in my experience, was. So this is a reading which makes sense, and I like it.
But I think it's much deeper. Purim is much deeper than everybody.
Right.
It's the kids' holiday, everybody, and who knows if you're supposed to get drunk. You're commanded to get drunk. You can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. But there's something, the whole business about Yom Kippurim and Yom Kippur and the parallel.
Hasidim make a big deal of this.
There's something there's much more. There's something much deeper about Purim that I don't know if a lot of us get.
And the weird way that the Talmud wants to justify that she slept with this boy is also strange.
Yeah, that's also very distasteful.
Really?
From a feminist point of view, it's particularly distasteful.
There are two explanations. She wasn't the active one. She was just there, and he was the active one.
Because it's in the category of Yehareg Val Yavor. She let her die and not transgress. But so how did she enter this position of being Ahasuerus'
and also that
wife?
he didn't want to make her transgress her religion, therefore it was all right. They have also something about
yes. that it was more le teavon and not la hachis, that it was this, But I'm just
Both
puzzling over.
definitions are weird.
The difference seems to me. I mean, there's an issue of the world of truth which we're trying to encounter in Yom Kippur, in its deepest reality, a world which isn't about apparel, strategies, concealment, and playing off forces, but of, as I said, Yom Kippur is about really. It's about undressing the layers of our spiritual self till our heart and conscience are in immediate proximity with truth. Whereas the world of the Megillah depends on cunning interplay of poses, really, and masks. So the contrast is very powerful, and maybe there's something in this tradition that the two festivals that will endure, Purim and Yom Kippur, that so long as we live in this earth, we need our Yom Kippur for obvious reasons, but we need our Purim because if we don't manage that kind of politics, we're sunk. So it was,
Well, we're living in a time of Histel Panim, which I think the Megillah is the epitome of a Histel Panim world, where God isn't even mentioned, and we're expected to see through, and to see through to the kernel of truth that is supposed to be there. That in spite of all the cunning, and in spite of all the labors of all the cunning people in both directions, whatever kind of justice kind of prevails. Now, whether we agree with the justice, whether, however you want to look at it, that is one of the views of Chazal about Purim, that it is a hiddenness that we are supposed to see through and beyond, into the world beyond the different people's, the best laid plans of men that God foils. That's the way we're supposed to see it. So I think that is a way.
Certainly, I mean, one could have a much more pious reading of the book,
much more pious reading.
But one could also say something else, a couple of thoughts, which is this is generally considered a late biblical book.
Mm-hmm.
So if one takes the late biblical books, really Job is the last time God is considered to speak in the Bible. Are we entering a world which the Bible is included, the Hebrew Bible, the Tenach is including in itself, in which God does not speak in the way God spoke in the Torah?
Definitely.
And the Tenach is saying this is part of the reality we encounter. And it's not just Hester Panim, it's not as a willed act of God that will be reversed. This is what life has to offer.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah,
that we're not seeing. What is not visible is that there are realities that are not visible, and we're supposed to look for them, and that's our job. I don't think it's a particularly pious view.
Okay, fine. Sorry.
I don't see it that way. I really didn't see that as a I got much more pious statements than that I wouldn't make.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. The other question which sort of troubles, it's not so much in relation to Megillah, it just troubles me full stop, is sometimes I think that the world divides into the Darwinists and the ethicists. That's a very careless division. But in a way, if you take the Darwinist, I mean, it's not really fair to Darwin, just use it as shorthand. Really, life is about survival. And ultimately, the moral price of one's deeds in order to survive will be forgotten. History will sooner or later forget, The fear of us as a people that the Holocaust will be forgotten will in time be more or less fulfilled. And therefore, don't worry about the moral cost. It's about survival. Force, brutality, power, these are the ultimate realities. And the ethicist says, wait a minute, no. First of all, we can't live like that. You can't say, Ein Yirat Elohim, Yesh Yirat Elohim. There is such a thing as a fundamental moral standard. And breaking it exacts revenge at some point, at some time. Hitler was going to be destroyed. And actually you cannot push the ethical frame of reference out of the way you read history and you read politics, because it carries an essential truth about human conduct, and truth and decency at some level win out, and evil does devour itself at some point. And our world is divided among these two positions, and that the Megillah is very much about, one level it's looking at what's the world like in Ein Yirat Elohim, like with Amalek. There is no fear of God, there is no moral standard, there is no, this is an amoral text. Simon,
well, how are we to read then the killing at the end? I mean, God hasn't, it's a killing that God hasn't ordained, and God hasn't told us to do that.
The 10 sons.
I mean,
the 10 sons and all the others.
Yeah.
Unless you're related to Amalek, in which case that's okay. If they were the 10 sons and Haman and he was part of Amalek, then God did order us. So maybe that's the reason that it says, answer my question.
Every prophet's got a letter saying that the Jews can defend themselves against their enemy.
No, he's saying to God.
Although I think,
what does he have to tell you personally? I don't understand.
No, I'm saying, are we in any way supposed to, when we read it, judge this killing? I mean, is it just okay? We read it and it's okay. Megillah him, they deserve it because they wanted to kill us. Or are we in some way supposed to wonder at it? I mean, was it too far? Did we go too far? Was it too bloodthirsty? And in which case, if we're to drink so that we don't know the difference between this and that, Haman or Mordechai, are we in some way obscuring that conversation, that internal?
I think that question simply stands as a problem the Megillah leaves us with. Maybe one can answer it sort of homiletically, or one can answer it this way or that, but I actually think it's a sharp issue. And I've also wondered, like you said, about that drinking until you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. On one hand, that suggests, well, there's all the difference in the world between Mordechai and Haman. And, well, Mordechai isn't busy advocating destroying Haman's people at the beginning for no reason. So there's a big difference. On the other hand, are we saying ultimately it's about who wins? So actually this is not about moral difference. This is about still cunning and successful manipulation.
Jonathan? Only because you said you like giving classes in Yerushalayim, and you're from London, and I'm from London originally as well. Something that always I think about a lot, at various different times of the calendar year, but a Purim is the where is the, how should the Jew in the exile today behave? Because on the one hand, Haman was irritated, and I remember learning as a child that one of the things that the non-Jews, the Gentiles, didn't like was we kept to ourselves, and that bothered them. On the other hand, there's the other side of the coin, where the Jews are influential in the exile, and they take part, they take positions. Ed Miliband, they don't know what's going to be in the elections. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned in that, which is, I'm saying, I don't know. As somebody who lives there, how should the Jew, does the Jew belong there? Because both ways, there's usually bad outcomes, whether it's anti-Semitism because he's keeping to himself, or whether he's trying to melt into the Gentile society there. And that's something that always makes me think, again, as somebody who lives here, as somebody who's made Aliyah, as somebody who wonders what the future is for the Jews in the exile today, given a situation which seems to be getting worse and worse.
And if I can piggyback on this, related somehow to where we are now, Netanyahu relationship with America as well. Do we rock the boat? I mean, maybe that's what you were hinting at. Politically, does he have to suck up to America?
Should he go speak to Congress?
Iran. I mean, maybe Iran. Persia.
That's in the
Well,
papers
should
today.
they?
That's in the papers today.
Yeah.
And do we rock the boat and do we say hello world? These people are out to get us, or do we suck up to America?
That's what I said. How should a Jew? What's the best
But
way
a
for a Jew to behave?
Also, a Jew in Galut, which I believe there is Galut, and a Jew.
I mean, I haven't got a great answer to that, but it seems to me.
We've just ganged up on you as well because you're the only one here. We've just ganged up on you.
Yeah,
as
well,
well.
I'm going to say something back which is quite strong. I think history reads the fact that there's no safe place for Jews enduringly for a long time anywhere, including Israel. Actually,
Including you're going to throw Israel in with the diaspora, really?
Sorry?
You're going to throw Israel in with the
Well,
diaspora?
they're not the same, but if you read history, there's been no safe place in perpetuity for Jews
So you don't
anywhere
believe
ever.
in the ultimate Gula of Jews in Israel?
I would love to, but I don't think you
Okay.
can say.
I do, and
I don't think you
I
can
take,
say
you know,
that the safety of Jews in Israel is guaranteed.
I never
I just don't think you said
our safety is guaranteed today. I do believe in the ultimate Gula, though, and I do believe in the ultimate, yes, and I'm not going to throw Israel in with the diaspora, I'm sorry.
But this,
I just can't.
I didn't say I throw them in. I just say that history reads that there is no enduring safe place for Jews.
But history's
Yes,
not
Jews
now.
anyway.
Just because we're
History's
not
not
headed
Israel in
in
the
doesn't
same
mean we're
position
not
it is
headed there,
now
sorry.
No, but it's had Jews in their land on several occasions. So
except that with history, this is the first and only time that we've actually, in modern history, that we've had a Medina, that we are
Legally.
Yeah, legally. I'm not saying
Legally it's up for grabs.
I'm not talking about kings. I'm not talking about Melachim and all that.
well, I mean, it may not be that easy to differentiate because that was recognised as a state in the politics of its day, and also the state under Persian and Roman law. But my take, and you might not be right, this is actually it's quite important. It's quite important to have Jews in different places, and that Jews can work together in those different places to strengthen one another. Netanyahu's words did not go down well in Denmark and France. Interestingly, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think that.
I think that's partly because it was Netanyahu who said them. It's not necessarily the words, but he doesn't. He didn't command. If he commanded sort of real respect before he said them, they might have been received differently. So I think it's not just the context.
Right or wrong, nobody's right or wrong. Nobody's going to accept that.
Yeah.
How does the jury, how do they feel? Is there any talk about what could happen if Miliband became prime minister and there would be a Jewish prime minister and how that may affect?
How Jewish is it?
I think Miliband is not regarded as particularly Jewish. The problems that Jews have, as many Jews have been traditional Labour voters, is the stance of his party on Israel, which, for instance, will hold me up from voting Labour in the way that I almost always have. I also think there's two things going on in the diaspora, and they're, in a way, there's a lot of similarity between. The place least affected is actually America at the moment, which is the classic tropes of anti-Semitism are around, and they go up and they go down. In Britain and most of Europe, they go up whenever anything's happening in the Middle East, and they go down again later. But the killings in Paris and Copenhagen, and I can't see. Sadly, I can't see any reason why this shouldn't happen again in London or elsewhere in Europe. I can't see the jihadist power. The ability for people to work within a network that's interconnected by the web, or people working as lone wolves. Every intelligence agency has said we can foil some things, but you can never be sure you foil everywhere. This is a phenomenon that is a part of our life now, and Jews are in the forefront. They're not the only people in the forefront. There are also people who are, who've been outspoken in terms of freedom, who dare to say anything which could be critical of Islam. But it seems to me that's a feature of it. It's not actually. It may be nourished sometimes by classic anti-Semitism, but it's not quite the same. It's its own thing, and I don't see it. Sadly, I don't see it as going away tomorrow. And I think my community knows that it lives with that, and any community knows that there's. I'm not convinced that it will never happen in America.
No.
I think this is a future. I think one of the things. I think one of the things one has to say is, please God, at the moment one's more likely to die in a car accident. That's so comfortable. It's so comfortable. Yeah, but I think it's a reality of life, and I think my community, talk to my community. I think we know that we can take measures and be sensible, but who's to stop? And wherever one is in the world, this is a form of outrage that is now current. In 50 years there'll be something else, but at the moment it's there.
It's always been there. It's always been there. Yeah. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the purpose of the exile was not to flourish, but the opposite. It was a punishment. That's the reason why we're expelled, because as Yechezkel says, so he brings them back, not because they've earned it, because they've merited it, so I'm saying, so maybe there is that need all the time for this anti-Semitism to remember, to make the Jews remember that that's not where they belong.
I would not. That's a very dangerous theology. That's a very dangerous theology. Because you finish up with a very nasty God. Okay, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan, and we look forward to you coming back to talk. Thank you, Dusty, who's not here, but she has given our house. Thank you, Effie, for filming at the last minute, and thank you, everybody, for donating to the guide dogs. It's very our guide dogs.